I'm Miss McKellar.
And I'm Miss Krout.
And you're listening to the Pastcast. Welcome back to episode 3.
Welcome. We're so excited to be back this week talking a little bit more about the Constitution.
Yeah, so last week we talked about how the Constitution of the United States fixed some problems of the Articles of Confederation.
Yes.
So what are we talking about today?
Today, we're really going to give you a rundown of the anatomy of our Constitution, of our 3 branches of government, and then some principles of the Constitution that you need to know that really helped us decide as a nation what was important for us whenever we were creating this new government and what ideas did we want to make sure that the Constitution upheld.
Yes, so before we get started, I want to point out one thing. These ideas were considered very radical or extreme for this time. It was crazy, or it was a crazy idea to give more power to the people or to the citizens rather than the people in charge.
Exactly. And like we talked last time, we created a system where we always have new leaders stepping in. Our House of Representatives serve for 2 years, our senators serve for 6 years, and our president serves for 4 years. So there's always a cycle of new leadership coming in, which was completely radical when over in Europe at the time, countries that were about the same development of us, they had monarchies still. So they were being ruled a lot of times by some sort of legislative body. For example, we know in Great Britain they had parliament, but they also had a king as well. So this was completely radical, the idea of we always have a shift in power. We always have new people coming in.
So, Ms. Krout, you are talking about the anatomy of the Constitution. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So we know anatomy. When you're talking about anatomy, a lot of times you're talking about the body. You know, we have arms, we have a heart, we have lungs, different parts. So the anatomy of the Constitution is just the different parts of the Constitution. And there's really 4 main parts that we need to go over to understand fully what makes up the Constitution.
All right. What's the first part?
The first part is the preamble. Way back when in my class, we talked about the Declaration of Independence, and that also had a preamble. Preamble is just an introduction. So anytime you hear the word preamble, you should just think introduction. So the preamble of the Constitution is introducing us to the Constitution. Its main point is to explain why the framers of the Constitution decided to give us a republic. And we're going to talk about what a republic is in a little bit, but really what points us to the direction of the fact that we're going to have a republic, a government for the people, is the first 3 words in the Constitution, which are we the people. And so it's all about the fact that it's not a king, it's not someone way high up, it's not a small group of people, but instead it's all citizens. We the people establish this Constitution together because ultimately the power of our government comes from the people.
Ooh, that is a powerful statement.
It really is. And it's, again, a radical idea at the time, but it's a beautiful idea, the fact that we have say in our government and we get to decide the things that we like and we don't like about our government.
All right, what's part 2?
Part 2 is going to be the articles. So we have 7 articles. This is kind of like your main part of the Constitution. So you think about if you're writing an essay, you have an introduction, and then you have your body paragraphs. This is like your body paragraphs. This is the meat of it all. And so it's going to outline the branches of government, which we're going to talk about in a second, the relationship between the federal government and the state governments, which we are also going to talk about. It tells us how the Constitution can be amended or changed, which is really important. Last time we talked about the fact that the Constitution is a living document, and so it can be changed if we don't like it. So it's going to tell us how we can do that. It also tells us that the federal government is the supreme law of the land. We learned last time that that's super important because under the Articles, the federal government didn't have enough power. Now it does. And it's also going to talk about the ratification of the Constitution. So basically when we signed it into law and we said, this is going to be our governing document.
There's a word that's really important for you to know, and that word is to ratify.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So to ratify means to sign into order or to approve. And so we did a lot of different discussions about the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. Lots of debates happened. It took a long time for us to get to a point where we said, okay, this is probably as good as it's going to get. This looks really nice. Then we had to say, okay, we have this document. Are we going to sign it into law? Are we going to make it our governing document? And we had already had a different governing document. And it didn't work out. And so there's going to be a big debate about whether or not we should ratify it. And it's all because of some people wanted to add something to the document and some people didn't want to add something to the document.
Yes, speaking of ratification, the 3rd part of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments in the Constitution, and they just list out the rights and freedoms that all U.S. citizens have. And it's meant to protect our rights from the government.
Exactly. And so that was the big debate. Should we add the Bill of Rights or should we not? We're going to have 2 groups. Federalists did not want to add the Bill of Rights. They said the Constitution is good as it is, and they wanted a stronger federal government. Whereas we're going to have anti-federalists who didn't want a strong government, who said we need to add the Bill of Rights to protect our individual rights. And so a compromise was made between the two groups. We would ratify the document, work on adding a Bill of Rights, and then a few years later, we added the Bill of Rights, which made the anti-federalists happy.
So what else is included in the Constitution?
Obviously, we add the Bill of Rights a couple years later, but this is a living document, so it can be changed whenever we want it to be changed. We just have a majority vote in Congress to make changes to it. And so the last part we call the other 17 amendments. Those are all the amendments that were added after the fact throughout the history of our nation. And it's just basically whenever we say, hey, we have a problem, we have an issue, we don't think the Constitution is right on this matter, we're going to amend it or change it, add an amendment to make it right.
Now that we've laid out the anatomy of the Constitution, let's move forward to the 3 branches of government.
Sounds good. So our first branch is the legislative branch. Article 1 of the Constitution is going to establish this branch, and its job is to make the laws.
Next, we have the executive branch. Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the executive branch. The role of the executive branch is to enforce laws.
Exactly. And then the last one is the judicial branch. Article 3 is going to establish the judicial branch, and its job is to interpret the laws. Now, let's talk really quick because we have each of these branches, but each of them kind of have a different name when we're talking about them in everyday life. We don't oftentimes just say the legislative branch did this. They have kind of other names. So for the legislative branch, its other name is Congress. And we talked about last time how Congress has 2 houses, House of Representatives and the Senate. So the other name for the legislative branch is Congress.
For the executive branch, when we think of the executive branch, it's the President of the United States. Remember, the President is not the only person in the executive branch, but he or she is the leader of the executive branch.
Exactly. What do we call the other people that the President appoints to work with them once they're voted into office?
That is the president's cabinet, and the president gets to choose who is a part of his or her cabinet.
Exactly. Now, don't think that they have too much power, though, because while they get to choose, Congress has to approve whoever they appoint. The last branch is the judicial branch. The highest court of the land is called the Supreme Court. So they are like the leader of the judicial branch. And then we have a system of federal courts, and then there's also a system of state courts. So we have different level of courts, but just think about it this way. Your judicial branch has your courts. So if you were speeding or you broke the law, you would be basically charged with a crime, and then you'd have to go to a court where they decide whether or not you broke the law.
Let's move on to the principles of the Constitution.
Perfect. Where's Mr. Pricig?
Not that kind of principle.
Oh.
The principles of the Constitution are values and beliefs and ideas that our Constitution holds.
Yes. And these are crucial. Again, we're creating a completely different kind of government than that's really ever been done before, at least successfully. And so these are the ideas that we really want to make sure our Constitution upholds because we find them to be the most important ideas of our country.
What's the first one?
Great question. The first one's going to be the separation of powers.
Didn't we just talk about that?
We did. So we just talked about the 3 branches of government, and that's how we separate the powers. The whole reason why we wanted to make sure that we separated the powers within different branches was because it all goes back to the American Revolution. We didn't want any one part of our government having too much power. We wanted to share the power so that way we can make sure no one holds too much power, no one can kind of take over and take hold of the government and take power away from the people.
So, separation of powers. One person in our government doesn't have the power to create, pass, and make sure that the laws are constitutional. That's separated between many, many people.
Exactly. And again, we talked about that before, but we have one branch to create laws, we have one branch to enforce laws, and we have one branch to interpret the laws. And that leads us to our second principle, which is checks and balances. So we separate the power between these 3, but then these 3 branches of government can check one another to make sure no one branch gets too powerful. So if one branch sees another branch doing something that they say, I don't think that's right, they can check their power.
How can they do that?
So an example of this is Congress can pass laws. So they have a bill, they introduce it, they debate about it, and then the House and the Senate pass it with a majority, right? That law then has to go to the president who's going to read it, and he has 2 options. He can either pass a law, sign it, and say, looks good to me, or he can veto it, which means he cancels it out. Then that law would have to go back to Congress, and for them to pass it again, they would have to pass it with 2/3 majority instead of half majority.
Okay, so that's an example about how the president can check Congress and how the Congress can check the president.
Exactly. But we got to get the judicial branch in there as well. So the judicial branch can look at the things that the president's doing or look at the things that Congress is doing and decide whether or not they're constitutional. So the president can put laws into order. They can't create laws. These are kind of like temporary laws, but they're called executive actions. The Constitution in Article 2, where it established the executive branch, specifically tells us what laws the president can put into place. But all of these are temporary. They're not changes to the Constitution. They're just kind of things to help run the day-to-day of our government. If someone in our country says, hey, I think that that's not constitutional, they can bring that case to the courts and basically say, I don't think this is constitutional. And then the courts would decide whether or not it is constitutional.
So how does the executive branch check the judicial branch?
That's a great question. So the executive branch can actually appoint Supreme Court judges and other federal judges. So they get to kind of decide who's going to be a judge. But again, that's a lot of power. So whoever they appoint has to be confirmed by the legislative branch.
Oh, that makes sense.
Exactly. It sounds a little complicated. And if we were to go through every single check that each branch has, it would be a lot because it's a complicated system. But just know it's all set in place to make sure no one has too much power and that our power is shared evenly and no one's doing anything illegal.
The next principle of the Constitution is republicanism.
Wait, I heard about that in Star Wars.
Well, they did have a republic in Star Wars, but in terms of the Constitution, it's a little different. Republicanism is the idea that citizens elect people to represent their ideas.
Oh, so we don't get to just vote on whatever we want?
No, when we go to the voting booth, we really don't vote on specific things that we want to change. We vote on people to do that for us.
But I don't understand. Why can't we just vote on whatever we want?
If we voted on every little thing, we would be at the voting booth a whole lot. And people don't really have time to do that.
Yeah, I have a full-time job.
Yes, but remember, the person that is elected is supposed to make decisions not on what they want, but what their constituents want.
Exactly. Constituents is just the people that they serve. So if at any point your senator or your representative in the House of Representatives is voting on things you don't like, you have the right to call them or to write them. It used to just be by letters, but now you can email them and tell them exactly what you think. They want to hear from you and they want to know your thoughts.
And if they're not doing a good job,
you can just not vote for them again and you basically fire them.
That's right.
So our next one is federalism. And this one can feel a little tricky, but I promise you, it's really not that hard to understand.
So what is it?
So federalism is basically how we distribute our power, not between the branches, but between the different levels of government. So we don't just have one government in this country. We actually have different levels. So we have the federal government at the top, the state government underneath, and then local governments at the very bottom.
So how do people know what laws to listen to and obey?
That's a great question. So we know in the articles, it outlined that the federal government is the supreme government. The Constitution has supremacy over everything, which just means it's the law of the land. So our Constitution lays out exactly what powers are given to the federal government. And those powers cannot be taken away from them. Whatever the federal government says, whatever laws they make regarding those things, that's what goes. The states can't ignore it. They can't just decide, I don't like that. They have to follow those laws. But whatever powers are not given to the federal government automatically go to the state governments. So the federal government can do things like manage our military, declare war, and they also do things like manage our mail services to make sure that we get our mail. So things like schools, issuing driver's license, speed limits, all of those things are powers of the state governments, not the federal government. And then any powers that don't go to the state governments automatically go to the local governments. So they get to make more of like the day-to-day laws, little small things that need to happen to make sure that things stay in order, but nothing that's like too drastic.
So this seems really confusing. Is there ever situations where maybe the states and the federal government don't agree on who gets to pass laws?
Yes, but that is why we have our judicial branch. A lot of times things like this will go to the courts and they basically ask, is this a power of the federal government or is this a power of the state government? It's then up to the judicial branch to look at the Constitution, study it closely, and figure out who gets the power. Sometimes, though, it can be really confusing because we have what's called concurrent powers. Concurrent just means shared. So some of the powers within the government are shared between the federal and the state. So some of our shared powers between the federal and the state government are establishing taxes, regulating banks, and establishing courts.
So this seems kind of confusing. Why don't we just make everything more simple and just have the federal government make all the laws?
That's a great question. Ultimately, it goes back to power and really the American Revolution. So before the American Revolution, each state had their own government, and we talked about salutary neglect, a period of time where the states were really allowed to decide whatever they want. They governed themselves, and as long as they were making Great Britain money, Great Britain had hands-off parenting and said, you can do whatever you want. So then after the American Revolution, these states wanted to keep that power. But in order for our nation to run smoothly and have peace, we knew we needed to create a stronger federal government. We saw that with Shays' Rebellion. If the federal government can't enforce its laws, then it will just be chaos. So we had to find this perfect system of where we share our powers, where we still allow states to have say in the things that they want, but the federal government has enough control to make sure that there's peace and that no one's acting out of line.
Although it's tricky, it makes sense because each state is different. What makes sense for one state might not make sense for another state. That way, states can make decisions for themselves that are best for their people.
Exactly. Here in South Carolina, we don't live our lives the same way that they do in Massachusetts. So we have to have say in how we do run our schools and things like that. If not, then we would all just be learning about the same things and you wouldn't be taking South Carolina history. All right, so federalism, really complicated. Good thing this next one is pretty simple. What is it?
This one is popular sovereignty. This is the idea that people rule themselves and that the power of the government comes from the people.
So where in the Constitution does it exactly tell us that the power of the government comes from the people?
It's back to the idea of the preamble. Remember, we the people.
Exactly.
The next principle of the Constitution is rule of law.
Yes. So this one is also pretty straightforward. It just means that no one is above the law, even those who govern. So even our highest position of president, that person is still under the laws. They can still get a ticket for speeding. They can still go to jail. They can still be convicted of crimes. If they do something wrong, they are going to be held to the consequences because no one is above the law.
So even famous people and celebrities have to follow the same laws that we follow?
Exactly. Even Taylor Swift. Our next one is a limited government. So why do we have a limited government?
This one is pretty straightforward. It's the idea that the government has little power. The Constitution specifically gives in detail the powers that the government has and the power that the people have. The last principle is individual rights.
Exactly. We all have individual rights, and those are spelled out for us in the Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists felt it was so important that we had a list of our rights so that way the government could not interpret the Constitution a certain way to take away those rights. They wanted them written out in black and white so that way we all knew that we were guaranteed those rights.
Ms. Krout, I love the Constitution.
I do too. I think it's my favorite document ever.
Truly, it gives us as U.S. citizens rights that not everyone around the world has. It's
Exactly.
such a privilege.
It really is. And it's amazing when we really start to study it and truly understand all of the work that went into creating this document. I mean, it's really hard to create a system of government that's going to survive for hundreds of years and is going to maintain the rights of the people. And so it's just incredible to learn about.
Is this something that can last forever and ever and ever?
I sure hope so. It's doing a pretty good job. And again, because it's a living document and we can change it whenever we want, I think it really speaks to how it's going to last the test of time.
Yes, and it's up to us as U.S. citizens to make sure we know our rights and to protect them, to make sure that we keep them safe.
Exactly. And we've also talked about the fact that the power gets passed on to new people every 2 years, 6 years, 4 years. So it's important that you use your voice one day. I know right now, if you're under the age of 18, you can't vote. But once you reach that age, it's so important to go and vote and have your voice heard because it really does matter.
So what are we learning about next week?
Oh, well, we're going to take a little pause on content because next week is Thanksgiving break, which is so exciting. So we won't have an episode next week, but don't worry because you're getting 2 episodes this week. On Thursday, we're releasing a special Thanksgiving episode.
Bonus episode.
It's so exciting. We are going to tell you the truth about Thanksgiving. It's not all that you think it is.
We're not being told the truth about it?
No, we're not. The stories you learned in elementary school are not quite true. And so we're going to give you the truth of it. It's going to be a lot of fun, a little break from the Constitution. But don't you worry. After Thanksgiving, we'll be back to talk a little bit more about the Constitution and some Supreme Court decisions.
Sounds good. Make sure you like, subscribe, and smash that notification bell so you know whenever we drop a video.
Exactly. And as always, we're here on YouTube, but we are also over on Spotify. So check us out over there.
Thanks for listening.
See you on Thursday. Bye.
Okay. Wait, can we go
We
back?
the
No,
people
it's fine.
in order to form a more perfect union.
Establish justice and assure domestic tranquility. Right?
Boom.
Provide
For the common defense. Promote the general welfare and ensure the blessings of a liberty to ourselves and our posterity to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Gosh, it goes so hard.
It really
So
does.
good.
It's so good.